Chapter 19. Matthew 19, and if you want to use one of the Bibles on the back of the chairs, 1528. Page 1528. I don't know if you heard the joke about it was 3 weeks after their wedding, and a lady was all in hysterics, and she called her pastor, and she said, "My husband and I had our first fight. It was awful. What am I going to do?" Pastor says, "Calm down, calm down. This isn't nearly as bad as you think. Every marriage has to have its first fight. It's normal." I know, she said, "but what am I going to do with the body?" It's true that marriage just have their challenges, and you may feel like killing your spouse. Just calm down. Don't get carried away. With God's help, our marriages need not end with the death of our spouse or with divorce either. God wants us to live together till death parts us. In this passage, we want to talk about marriage, children, and money. How many knows those three kind of tie together sometimes? I don't know if they were specifically put in this chapter because of that, but I do know that in real life they tie together. And before I start, I want to say something. Many in our society, and I'm sure there's been those in our congregation here have been touched or wounded by divorce. I want to reassure you that we here at First Assembly care about you and believe that God can do great healings in your life. And we want to do everything we can to encourage that healing, whether it was your parents that divorced or whether you had the divorce or your friend was divorced or whatever. Virtually everyone here has been touched by some area in our life because of this. And we believe that God can bring about healing. Having said that, let's now look at the scripture in Matthew 19. Beginning in verse 1. When Jesus had finished saying these things, he left Galilee and went into the region of Judea to the other side of the Jordan. Large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. Some Pharisees came to him, and they asked, some Pharisees came to him to test him. They asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Haven't you read," he replied, "that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female? And he said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife. And the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one. Therefore what God has joined together, let man not separate." "Why then," they asked, "did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away?" Jesus replied, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness and marries another woman commits adultery." So here we see in this passage, the Pharisees come testing him. Notice it says to test him. They knew that this was a very difficult topic. And it was close to the hearts of a lot of people because a lot of people have been wounded by this. And so they come, and so they're not really wanting the answer. They're wanting to corner him by something he says so they can alienate a lot of people from him. So they come testing him. But when they say, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason?" they're alluding to a passage in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy chapter 24. And let me read that, 24:1. It says, "If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to himself because he finds something indecent about her, he writes her a certificate of divorce and gives it to her and sends her from his house." So there that says, he finds something indecent about her. So they were alluding to this, but when they say it's lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason, because there was two schools of thought in Jesus' day. One was a school of thought by Hillel, and he came to the conclusion that if he found anything indecent in her, that meant for any reason that bothered the husband. So basically, Hillel would say, if your wife burns your dinner, you can kick her out. That's basically what it came down to with him. But on the other hand, you had Shammai, another large block of Jewish people, who said, no, the only reason you can divorce your wife is if she's been maritally unfaithful to you. And in America, I would say probably most of America has come to the conclusion of, with no-fault divorce, of Hillel, which basically says you don't even have to hardly give a reason, I don't think, anymore, do you? You just say, I don't want to be married, and that's it. And so that was the issue. So they're asking this question, what's a good reason to divorce your spouse? Jesus is going to turn it on their head and say, wait a minute, you're approaching this from the whole wrong vantage point. You should be asking, how can I keep this marriage together if possible? Not how can I get out of it, but is there a way I can keep it together? Now, Jesus is going to later on recognize there are some marriages that you can't salvage. But he wants to say, you're trying to say, how can I get out of the marriage? I want to say, how can you keep the marriage together if it's possible? So he then refers to the creation account in Genesis, and he says, haven't you read? He replied that at the beginning, the Creator made them male and female. And that's referring to Genesis chapter 1 and verse 27. Why don't I read that? Genesis 1:27. Because these are two very important passages on this topic. Genesis chapter 1, verse 27 says, so God created man in his own image, and the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. So we read that God here is not just, this is not just a story of what happened, it is that, but it's a story of what happened, which becomes a pattern for life for us. And that's the way Jesus is approaching this. So he's saying he made them male and female. He didn't make them male and male or female and female. He made them male and female. Why? So that they could come together and be a couple. And so he assigned them their sex too. How many of you got to choose whether you're a man or a woman? Nobody does that. People are trying to do that today. But they really can't, because God is the one who has assigned us who we are. He's the one who created us as we are. And then he says, okay, God made the male and female. Why? So that a man could leave his father and mother and be united to his wife. And that's Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24. It says, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh. So here Jesus is saying this passage is a prescription for relationships going forward. When a man leaves his father and mother, he is to cling and be united to his wife. They're no longer one, but two. And since God has then joined that couple together, we shouldn't try to split it apart. It's kind of like this. How many knows I could cut my arm off? I could, right? Would it do me or my arm any good? Both of us would suffer. Why? Because it's part of me. It's me too. That's the marriage relationship. And anyone who's been affected by divorce, they don't want to go through it again. At least anybody I know has gotten in their right mind. They don't. How many people go in their marriage and say, I can't wait till the day I'm in divorce court and we're fighting it out? People don't do that. They may end up there because of things that have happened in life, but that's certainly not their goal if they got any thinking at all. And so Jesus says, hey, wait a minute. What God has put together, it's not a good idea to pull apart, because like cutting your arm off, you're both going to be hurting. My arm's going to be dying and I'm going to be hurting. I think the vast majority of people want a relationship that's genuinely going to last for life. That's why you get married. It doesn't always end up that way, but that's the goal. That's the goal in people's minds. At least that's what they're hoping is the goal. And so Jesus is saying, wait, that's a good goal. Don't pull apart them. But so then they ask, well, why then did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? So they've asked him this question, what's a good reason to get a divorce? Jesus says, wait a minute, you're focusing in the wrong direction. We should be focusing on how can we keep this thing together. But then they respond back, why did Moses give this certificate of divorce? And Jesus said, because the hardness of your heart. Somebody somewhere in the process has allowed their heart to harden, whether it's both or one, or somebody has, because that's what happens when people break apart. They're not like, oh, I love you so much. You know, that some hardening has gone on in the process. And Jesus then goes on to state that there's only one legitimate reason to be the one who seeks a divorce. And he says, I tell you, anyone who divorces his wife, except for marital unfaithfulness and marries another woman, commits adultery. So Jesus, and the word there in the original language Greek is porneia, and it's a reference to any sexual immorality. So it includes things like adultery, homosexual acts, and that kind of stuff. Anything of a sexual nature that's outside of the marriage bond is considered wrong. And so that is what breaks that and allows for a person to pursue. It doesn't even command that they have to get a divorce. He didn't say, if your wife is ever unfaithful, you have to get a divorce. He says you can get a divorce if the circumstances seem right. Now, what's interesting is in the Old Testament, it says that somebody who committed adultery, the punishment for that was what? Death. Right? In the Old Testament. But then Jesus in the New Testament, when the woman's caught in the very act of adultery, and they're saying, should we stone her? What does Jesus do? Neither do I condemn you, and go and sin no more. Did God somehow change his mind? No, I think this is what was happening. In the Old Testament, the prescription for either a man or woman who had become adulterous and who was defiantly persistent in that could be given the death penalty. It's kind of like this in our own culture. Somebody steals something, you have the prescribed limit of which a judge can give for that crime, right? But they can give less of a punishment depending upon circumstances. And I think that's what God was doing in the Old Testament. It's possible to have someone put to death for adultery, but it's not like the person who just in a moment of insanity has a one-night stand and they never do that again. That's not right, right? That's not right. But that's different from somebody who's persistently, defiantly in a lifestyle of adultery. See, and so Jesus looked at that woman, I believe, and that was not, she might have done what was wrong. Yes, it was wrong. But she wasn't that hard-hearted, hardened person who, that God in the Old Testament said that could merit the death penalty. And so I think that's what's happening here. So Jesus, when he says, allows for a person to pursue divorce. Now, he doesn't deal with the person who's divorced. Paul deals with that in 1 Corinthians 7. There's no way I can deal with every nuance of this issue in one sermon. It would be like a couple of sermons, okay? So I'm just kind of emphasizing the points I see in this passage. If you have questions or comments or concerns about issues that I don't mention or the direction it seemed like I went, please ask me afterwards or call me or text me or something, because there's just too much to deal with. But Paul deals with what happens if you're in a marriage relationship and someone divorces you. What do? Here it's more like, he's talking to the people and saying, hey, wait, you are to pursue trying to hold the marriage together. And the only reason you would break it is if your partner is being unfaithful to you. Then you've lost the marriage anyhow. The other issues like abuse and all those can be dealt with in all kinds of ways. There can be separations, there can be counseling, so I could preach whole sermons on that too, right? But what we're dealing with here, I think, is that Jesus is trying to emphasize that the goal of us should be the goal that God had, is to keep the thing together if at all possible. And that's what he's trying to emphasize here. And so he says that. But when Jesus says, only reason you can pursue divorce is for unmarital faithfulness, the disciples respond to that. The disciples said to him, if this situation is between a husband and wife, it is better not to marry then. They say, wait a minute, if the only reason I should be pursuing divorce, because sometimes people have tough goes trying to work things out. And how many of you, if you've been married long term, some of you had some rough spots somewhere along the line that were challenging, and you stuck to it and you worked through it. And so the disciples recognized and said, wait a minute, if I can't just get out of this thing, maybe I shouldn't get married. And how many knows that it's dangerous in one sense, and how many of you were afraid on your marriage day and happy at the same time? I was very happy. But there was a little bit inside of me that said, I'm getting this, and I, as a Christian, I'm going to try to hold this thing together. It's a little bit scary, this commitment I'm making. I'm glad I did. I got a good one. But it was a scary thought. You know, because, yeah, you might know them, but do you really know them when you first marry them? No. You learn about them over time. And so, people in our society, I think a lot of people are afraid. And so they're afraid to commit for various reasons. And so sometimes they don't. Many of you probably have heard of Wilt Chamberlain, especially if you're a little bit older. He used to be one of the most phenomenal basketball players of all time. And I remember when I was a kid, he was just, he was the guy who could put it in the hoop, you know. He was one of the, the guys. But also, one thing, he's also, if you know him very well at all, he was also well known for a statement that he had been with 20,000 women during his lifetime. That was his claim to fame. But you know what he said after all that? This is what he said. That he would trade all of that for one woman who would stay with him. See, he had lived what many people see as the crazy life. It would be so cool. At least that's how some people think. But when he lived that, he came to realize that being with one person for life is where it's really at. It's kind of like this. Chris, no Chris here, the different Chris, this was a guy. And he had been in a terrible accident. And he was unconscious for a number of days. And then the neurosurgeon came in to explain the situation to him. And the neurosurgeon said, whenever your lungs clear up from pneumonia, we will attempt to reconnect your skull to your spine. How many knows he's in a terrible fix? They said, we don't even know if you'll live through it. We don't know if it's going to help, but it's the only shot we got. And he had to decide whether he was going to have this surgery. And he was very despondent, wondering if he should just give up on life. And his wife came in, and they began to talk about everything. And his wife looked at him and said, I'll be with you for the long haul, no matter what. And then she added the words that he said just saved his life. She said, you're still you, and I love you. And you know what he responded back? This is way beyond the marriage vows of in sickness and in health. And she mouthed back, I know. Now, how many wouldn't trade that for Wilt Chamberlain's life? See, that's why Jesus, I think, was emphasizing, hey, it's about trying to keep these things together, not what's the easiest way to get out. Because we all will face challenges. And that's why the disciples said, wait a minute, maybe it's better not to get married then. And I think people in our culture are looking around and saying, our marriages, and so many of them are disintegrating, and many of us have been touched by it and hurt by it. And we say, what's the solution? Is it just not to get married? And that's what many people are doing. But what happens then is that people just live together. Does that solve the problem? No, because it doesn't lead to the lives like Chris had, where someone's committed to you for life. In fact, when people just live together, it actually works counterproductive to what they're trying to get, because it makes it less likely for that relationship to go the long haul. It just does. It sows seeds of distrust. So Jesus said, yeah, in some cases, some people should remain single. In fact, says, not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. For some are eunuchs because they are born that way. Others were made that way by men, and others have renounced marriage because of the kingdom. The one who can accept this should accept it. So they're saying, maybe we shouldn't get married. No, Jesus says, wait a minute, there's only few who should be in that category. But if they're in that category and God has given them the gift of singleness, that's okay. Now, if you're married, some of us, like I'm married, obviously, and I've been married a long time, and I love being married. So it's hard for me to imagine being single all my life. But you know what? God has gifted some people like that. And we should not look at them strangely. They're not like defunct or anything. It's just that God has given them this gift of singleness, and it's okay. And I think in the Protestant church, we need to recognize that. It's okay if a person has been gifted with being single their whole life. You know, we try to marry them all off. Well, many people need to be married, but not everybody does, because God has gifted some with single. But those who God has called to be married, let your emphasis be where it should, of holding the thing together. Okay, verse 13 now. We switch topics here, but it comes together. Then the little children were brought to Jesus for him to place his hands on them and pray for them. But the disciples rebuked those who brought them. And Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." When he had placed his hands on them, he went on from there. Jesus saw the children as precious. What's interesting is in the book of Malachi, Jesus, talking about the issue of marriage and divorce, recognized that keeping a marriage together has a powerful positive effect on children. It really does. And so we got to pray that God will help us all in these areas. Okay, so we've dealt with those issues. Now let's go on to the next issue, which is money. And how many knows, in marriages, probably one of the toughest issues for many couples to work through is what? Money. How many couples have ever had a discussion about money? Some of you never have, right? You've been married for years and you've never even had to discuss the issue. It just works itself all the way out, right? Oh, no way, right? No, you got to work through these issues. So anyhow, this man comes, and I'm going to paraphrase the story because otherwise I won't finish my sermon. We'll be here all day, okay? So this man comes to Jesus and says, "Hey, what good thing do I need to do to get to heaven?" And Jesus says, "Well, have you kept all the commands?" And he says, "Yeah, all from my youth." And then Jesus says, you just need to do just one more thing. Take all your goods, sell them, give the money to the poor, come follow me. The man goes away sad. He had a lot of things, and they had him. So he refuses to do that. And then Jesus has this teaching to the disciples saying how hard it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And then Peter says, "Hey, we gave up everything." And Jesus says, "Well, you're going to be rewarded for that." Now that's my long and short of it. So let's talk about that for a minute. See, money had a hold of this man. And it'll prevent us from getting to heaven, but how many knows it'll also prevent us from having good marriages? If one person in the marriage is consumed with money, how many knows they never want to share that money with their spouse? So if you go to somebody's house and they got this mansion of a garage, and the guy's got every imaginable tool and tinker thing in his garage, and you go in the house and you've got 1920s kitchen stuff and everything's broken, you know who's in control of the money there, right? Or if you go and there's this kitchen that's mammoth and you got a 5x7 garage for the guy, who's in control of the money there? You know what I'm trying to say? So if one is consumed by, that's what I'm saying. We need to, and I told this story before, and I love to tell it because my brother-in-law, he'd saved up a whole bunch of money because he was going to get something. I can't remember what he wants. A motorcycle. He wanted a motorcycle desperately. And he finally got almost all the money together, and he found out his wife really wanted a new keyboard. He took his money and bought that keyboard. That said volumes to his wife. Not that he can't, hopefully someday he'll get a motorcycle. But at the time, that's all he had the money for, and he got that. So that's what I'm trying to say here. Here's this man, though. He has lots of money, but it's got a hold of him. Got a hold of him. Marvin Jacobs was a San Francisco lawyer, and he bought his dream Jaguar, only to find that it didn't exactly make his life complete. The USA Today was doing an article on lemon laws. And Marvin Jacobs' Jaguar was a lemon. He bought it, and in the first 3.5 years, he had it into the shop 26 times. One time, it stalled on the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco during rush hour, causing a 5-mile backup with his new Jaguar. When California's limited law finally forced Jaguar to buy back his car, Jacob said this: "The best thing that ever happened to me in my entire adult life," when they bought back his Jaguar. Now, lest you think I am bashing, or the Bible bashes against having things, that is simply not true. It's not even against if you have a Jaguar. I don't care if you have a Jaguar. It's against things having us. Why? Because things can and will at times fail us. They get a hold of us. They get its claws into us. And the result is they eventually fail us, just as even Jaguars can fail you, but God never does. You have to have your faith and trust in Him, not in your things, not in your money. It just doesn't work. Otherwise, it becomes just like this. When I was a kid, we used to live kind of out in the rural areas, and one of my neighbors decided he wanted a cow, but nobody had any fences. So what did he do? He got one of those quick fences, electric fence, and he put it around just right in front of our yard. Well, no, you know how kids are. Electric fence, hey, no big deal, electric fence. One of the kids, grabs onto it. That's the stupidest thing. Why? Because if you grab onto an electric fence like this, how many knows what happens? Okay, that's the least of your worries. Okay, somebody hurt. You can't let go. Because the electrical pulse, so you control your arm with electrical pulses, and that electric just causes your hand just to grip down. And you can't let go hardly. You have a terrible... Never touch electric fence, but if you ever do, always do it like this. Because your hand will tighten on and you can pull it off, right? You farmers know what I'm talking about. But he was just a kid and he just went like it. And that's just like money. You grab a hold of money and it grabs a hold of you and you're like this. You can't let go. It's got a hold of you. And even when God Himself, that's what happened. God Himself was standing in front of this man and says, you want to get to heaven, this is what you got to do. Sell all your things. He couldn't do it because his things had him. And so we must never let things get a hold of us, but what do we need? We need God's help. And that's why Jesus was speaking, Jesus looked at them and said, with man this is impossible, with God all things are possible. How do we get free from materialism? How do we get free from things like that? It's with God's help. It's so easy for it to get into our spirits where we just become consumed with this. And all of us are tested periodically. How many of you, every once in a while, you just get something and you just want that thing? Or you have something, you just, oh man, I'm just so important, I got this. You know, these feelings start to well up and you have to say, no, I don't want no part of that. I don't want no part of that. I want to be humbly serving my God. If I have millions or I have nothing. That's what we got to say. So we must not allow those things to get a hold of us because they will. And this young man, well, the interesting thing is if you read all the parallel accounts, this man was young. He was a ruler, so he's influential. He had lots of money. And he did all the commands. It would be kind of like if a church had some guy in their church who was the CEO of the local company, came to church 3 times a week, paid his tithes, taught Sunday school, served on the board, was in a community and some service organizations. How many people are like, whoa, that's the model guy? And he was 28. That's the kind of guy this was. But Jesus said, there's one thing that you're not to hang on to that's got you, because I've got to be first. See, Jesus comes to us and He says, if I'm going to be your Lord and I'm going to be your God, I'm not going to be second. I'm not going to be after your position or after your money or after whatever it is that you like so much. He's got to be number one. Because that's what the term God means. God means in charge. Doesn't it? Doesn't that... I presume that God, He's God, that He's in charge. Because if He's not in charge, we're in a world of hurt. And so he knew that this young man had everything that looked so good. But his heart wasn't in the right place. And that's what we've got to watch as church people. We may have all those outside things, but if there's ever anything that begins to surface in our hearts, that begins to take first place, Jesus will come to us and say, if you want to be my follower, you've got to get rid of that. It can't be more important than me. We've got to submit to Him. It's a wonderful thing. And then He says, you know what will happen? And everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or family or mother or children or fields for my sake will receive 100 times as much and will inherit eternal life. He who gives up that which he cannot keep to keep that which he cannot lose is no fool. He's no fool. The worship team could come back at this time. So we've seen our emphasis in life, in our marriages, should be on doing everything we can to keep it together. And if you've been in a situation where that didn't happen, I feel for you. And I pray that God will be with you and encourage your heart and strengthen you. Children are important, and I pray that each of us will acknowledge that just as Jesus did. And let's take the example of a young man that Jesus talked to who had allowed finances to get a hold of him and run his life. And we take our finances and put them on the altar. One time I read a story, this is years ago, about some guy who was really in financial straits, and he was I think he owned a small company at the time. And what he did is he was just so distraught. He came to the altar and just threw his wallet on the altar, saying, God, it's yours. Because he just knew he had to give it all, make sure that money didn't have a hold of him. That man happened to, his company turned around and did very well. But that might not happen. But the point is, money cannot have us. We've got to have it. And God has us. Praise the Lord. Well, we're going to go to the Lord here in prayer.